Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the endocrine system and the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal cortex is part of the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are located on top of the kidneys, as you can see in the right-hand photo. And the adrenal glands are made up of two parts, the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer, and the adrenal medulla, which is the inner layer. And the adrenal glands produce hormones that help regulate metabolism, the immune system, blood pressure, and respond to stress. So here's a video just giving an overview of what the adrenal glands do.
During periods of stress, such as preparing to run in a race, the brain signals the adrenal glands to produce epinephrine or adrenaline. Epinephrine increases the rate in which the heart beats. In turn, the increased cardiac output supplies more oxygen to the muscles, putting the body in a heightened state to react. As a longer-term response to stress, cortisol is secreted by the adrenal glands, promoting the release of energy.
All right. So more into the adrenal cortex. So this part of the adrenal glands produces corticosteroids that help with long-term stress, and it is composed of three zones: the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. And these zones help produce the hormones needed. So the hormones produced are steroid hormones and are lipid soluble. And the two corticosteroids produced, the main ones, are glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. And they also produce a small amount of sex hormones called gonacorticoids. So as you can see, the innermost layer is the zona reticularis, and the outer layer is the zona glomerulosa. So the zona glomerulosa is made up of secretory cells that are in an oval cluster and divided by trabecula. And this layer produces the mineralocorticoids. The main one is aldosterone. And the function of these hormones are to help maintain the electrolyte and water balance in the body and help with increasing blood pressure. So the production of aldosterone is a bit different than the other ones because this is mainly regulated by the renin-angiotensin system. So this system is used to regulate blood pressure, and aldosterone is secreted when angiotensin 2 is produced. So this is produced when the blood pressure falls, which then releases the enzyme renin to make angiotensin 1, and then angiotensin 2 is produced and then goes to the receptors on the adrenal glands, which stimulates the production of aldosterone. So aldosterone has other factors that affect its production. So one of them is the increased potassium concentration in the blood. So this will increase the production of aldosterone because aldosterone, part of its job is to secrete sodium and water into the bloodstream, and then in return it'll take out the potassium in the blood. So with the increase of potassium in the blood, aldosterone will be needed. And then also increased levels of angiotensin 2 because it stimulates the adrenal glands to produce aldosterone. And then increased sodium concentration in the blood. This will decrease the production of aldosterone because aldosterone is used to help put back in the sodium into the blood. So if there's already high concentration, there is no need for aldosterone produced as much. And then the secretion of ACTH will increase slightly the production of aldosterone because it is the hormone that stimulates the adrenal glands to produce the hormones. So As said before, aldosterone helps regulate the water and cell balance in the body. And when aldosterone is secreted, it will then go to its target cells in the distal renal tubule and cortical collecting duct on the nephron. And the nephron is a functioning part on the kidney. So once aldosterone binds to these receptors on the renal tubule, ion channels are produced to help increase the sodium and water diffusion from the kidneys into the blood. And by putting this water into the blood, it will help increase the blood pressure, and then potassium is then secreted out of the blood into the urine. So on the left is just the diagram of the steps needed for aldosterone to work. And here's a video of showing
All right, let us
how
focus on
aldosterone
each of these three adrenal cortex hormones and see what they do, beginning with mineralocorticoids. To understand mineralocorticoids, we need to know about the kidneys and their functional units called the nephrons. So the nephrons are the functional units of the kidneys. There are millions of these. And these guys are responsible for filtering, reabsorbing, and secreting things from our body, and thus also has a major role in controlling our blood pressure. So kidneys, the nephrons, have a big role in controlling blood pressure. When there is a decrease in blood pressure, the kidneys will reabsorb water and sodium back into the blood, and either reabsorb or secrete potassium in exchange. The increase in water and sodium in the blood will then increase blood pressure back to normal. Aldosterone secreted by the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal cortex will actually stimulate this process, thereby increasing blood pressure. Aldosterone primarily works at the distal part of the nephron, known as the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So aldosterone stimulates water and sodium retention, thereby increasing blood pressure.
All right, so that was just a summary of how aldosterone works with the kidneys. All right, so the next zone is the zona fasciculata, and this is the middle layer. This is made up of parenchymal cells that are in columns, and this is where glucocorticoids are produced. Glucocorticoids help with the conversion of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates to energy. They help with blood pressure and the blood glucose levels. And the main glucocorticoid produced is cortisol. So glucocorticoids are produced through a negative feedback loop. So when the body is in a stressful situation, the hypothalamus secretes corticotropin releasing hormones, which trigger the anterior pituitary gland to secrete ACTH, adrenal corticotropin hormones, into the bloodstream. And then ACTH will then travel through the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex, where it will stimulate the zona fasciculata to produce the glucocorticoids. And when there are enough glucocorticoids in the bloodstream, it will then send a signal to the hypothalamus to stop secreting the corticotropin-releasing hormones, which will then end the pathway of the hormones being released. So cortisol helps with regulating long-term stress response, and it has two main functions. So it breaks down fats and muscles to increase the blood glucose levels, and then also it activates anti-stress and anti-inflammatory pathways. So the main role is to increase glucose levels, and they do this through glycogenesis. And this is when glucose is formed from non-carbohydrates. So this could be from amino acids or fatty acids. So cortisol does this by breaking down muscles to amino acids and adipose tissues to fatty acids for the liver to make glucose. And it also blocks glucose from other tissues than the central nervous system. So your body has the energy needed to act in the way needed for the stressful situation. And cortisol has many target cells in the body, and when it binds to the receptor, it will then enter the nucleus and then can activate or inactivate the gene expression as needed. So one of the genes affected is FKBP5, and this gene is part of the immunophilin protein family, and it helps with the immunoregulation and basic cellular processes in the cell. And this specific gene helps with the negative feedback loop of glucocorticoids. So when the cortisol binds to its receptor, the FKBP5 is replaced with a positive glucocorticoid receptor that turns the gene FKBP4 on, and then FKBP4 then goes into the nucleus and is transcribed for regulatory activity of the feedback loop. So the innermost layer is the zona reticularis, and this is where it produces small amounts of gonocoroids, and most of the gonocoroids are produced in the testes and ovaries. It produces androgen hormones, and androgens are responsible for masculine characteristics. So the major hormones gonocoroids produce are dihydroepiandrosterone and androstenedione, and these are precursors for testosterone and estrogen. So when these hormones are released into the blood, they go to their target cells in the gonads, and in male cells, these are the Leydig cells, and the females, these are the ovarian stroma, where they are converted to testosterone and estrogen, and these hormones are mostly used during puberty. So these androgens in women are used for helping with hair growth under the arms, and then also with the growth spurt. And then in adulthood, they help regulate the libido. And then in men's, they have little effect because the majority of the androgens are produced in the testes. So these androgens help with the facial hair, Adam's apple, and development of reproductive tissues. So these hormones are produced when ACTH is produced. So this is, again, when the body is in response to stress. The hypothalamus will release the corticotropin-releasing hormones, which then will signal the anterior pituitary gland to release ACTH. And then the ACTH will then trigger the zona reticularis to produce gonocoroids. And these gonocoroids are regulated by a negative feedback loop, but the negative feedback loop is from when the glucocorticoids are produced. Once it sends a signal to the hypothalamus to end the production of corticotropin-releasing hormones, it will then end the pituitary gland from releasing ACTH, so the production of gonocoroids in the zona reticularis will end.
Stress. However, in the long-term stress response, the adrenal cortex has a bigger role.
So here is just an overview, a summary of how the feedback loops for the adrenal cortex.
Long-term stresses will actually just essentially cause the hypothalamus in the brain to release corticotropin-releasing hormone, which then will target cells in the anterior pituitary gland to release another hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH for short. ACTH will enter circulation of the blood and target cells within the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex. It will stimulate the cells within the glomerulosa, zona glomerulosa, to release mineral corticoids, mainly aldosterone. ACTH will stimulate cells in the zona fasciculata to release glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol. ACTH will stimulate cells in the zona reticularis to release androgens. Out of these three hormones, the glucocorticoids has the very important role in providing a negative feedback to the brain. What I mean by negative feedback is that if there is an increase in glucocorticoids in circulation, this will send a negative feedback signal to the hypothalamus, telling it to reduce the production of corticotropic releasing hormone, and thus reducing the whole cascade from there. All right.
So that's how all of these hormones are produced. So a disorder that is caused by the adrenal cortex is Addison's disease. So here is just an intro to what it is.
Primary adrenal insufficiency, also known as Addison's disease, is a rare endocrine disorder that happens when the adrenal gland isn't able to produce enough of the hormones that the body needs, particularly aldosterone and cortisol. The reason it's called primary is that the underlying problems localize to the adrenal gland itself, rather than a problem of a hormone that acts on the adrenal gland or elsewhere in the body. Watch the full.
All right. So, as it said in the video, Addison's disease occurs when the adrenal cortex is damaged, and this can be due to many factors. So one of them is autoimmune destruction. So your immune system is targeting your healthy adrenal cortex tissues, which won't allow it to function properly. Tuberculosis, which can cause it by having the infection in the lung travel to the adrenal cortex, or the travel of cancer to the adrenal cortex. And then also the lack of ACTH being produced, because this hormone helps signal the adrenal cortex to produce the hormones needed. So as a result, the hormones aren't produced and the body cannot regulate itself properly. So here are some of the symptoms, and the symptoms vary on which zone is affected. So the zona glomerulosa, which is the outermost layer, this is where the mineralocorticoids are produced, and mostly aldosterone. Main one is aldosterone. So this will result in low blood volume, and this is because aldosterone is not produced and won't be able to secrete sodium and water into the blood, making the volume greater. And also there will be high levels of potassium and low levels of sodium, and this imbalance can cause a craving for salt, nausea, and vomiting. If the zona fasciculata, which is where cortisol is produced, it can cause low blood sugar, which is hypoglycemia, and this is because cortisol will not be able to do glycogenesis and produce glucose for the blood. And and then also, because glucose is not being produced as much, the pituitary gland will be overworking because there's no negative feedback to tell the hypothalamus to turn off. So as a result, the pituitary gland will secrete another hormone called propranolocortin, and this is a precursor for melanocyte, and melanocyte hormone is responsible for skin pigment. So with an increase of propranolocyte, more melanocyte will be produced, which then will cause the darkening of the skin. And then you will also have, if the zona reticularis is damaged, this is in more serious cases, it will affect women more than men, because men have most of their androgens produced in their testes. So for women, this will affect their hair growth, so there'll be less hair growth under the arms because androgens are responsible for that. And then also it can decrease the libido. So some treatments for this are patients can take supplement hormones. So for the lack of cortisol, they can take hydrocortisone tablets, or low aldosterone, they can take fluorocortisone acetate. So another disorder cause is Cushing's syndrome. So this is when there are high levels of cortisol in the body, and this can be caused by exogenous factors or endogenous factors. Exogenous are factors that happen outside the body, and then endogenous are factors that happen inside the body. So an example of an endogenous factor is corticosteroids medications. So these medications are used for autoimmune and inflammatory disorders like asthma. And so the medication has a close structure to cortisol, and so will mimic the role of cortisol. So one way it will do this is a negative feedback loop. So the body will think that has a lot of cortisol produced in its body when it really doesn't. So it'll shut off the hypothalamus from producing the corticotropin releasing hormones. So as a result, if this happens over a long period of time, it can then shrink the zona fasciculata, which won't be able to produce the cortisol. But even though the zona fasciculata isn't producing cortisol, Cushing's syndrome is still caused because of the excess amount of the corticosteroid medications. So some endogenous factors are when the body makes too much cortisol. So this can be due to a pituitary adenoma, which is a tumor, and this tumor will then bind on the pituitary gland, and as it grows, it will produce more ACTH, which then will signal the adrenal cortex to produce more cortisol than needed. There are also adrenal tumors, and these will then grow and produce more cortisol than needed, and then this can affect, again, the negative feedback loop by shutting off the hypothalamus from allowing the pituitary gland to produce ACTH, and if this happens again over a long period of time, the zona fasciculata will shrink. And since these tumors grow independent from the stimulus hormones, they are able to produce cortisol on their own, which then will cause Cushing's syndrome. So some of the symptoms. So you will have high blood sugar, so hyperglycemia, and this is due to the large amount of cortisol doing glycogenesis, creating more glucose that will go into the bloodstream. And then with this high glucose blood level, this will then cause the insulin levels to increase, and the insulin will then make the cells around the center, which is in the waist and the buttocks, and this will cause these cells to accumulate more fat, which will cause central obesity. And also it can make the extremities very thin, and this is because cortisol is used to break down the muscles and adipose tissue to create fatty acids and amino acids for glucogenesis. So as a result, it will cause the extremities to thin. And it can also cause high blood pressure, and this is because cortisol and the mineralocords have a similar structure. So the cortisol can then bind to the receptors for the mineralocords and then take out that effect by raising the blood pressure. Yes, it can also affect the immune system because cortisol is used as an anti-inflammatory. So if there's so much, it can then suppress the body so much that it suppresses the immune system, which will make the person more susceptible to infections. So some treatments for Cushing's syndrome. So they can remove the tumor in the pituitary or adrenal ones, and then also reduce the corticosteroids, so the medication that they use if they can, so they don't have as much as the medication in it to take over. Also, there's radiation therapy to help remove the tumors if they weren't able to do surgery. They can also take medications that will help reduce their cortisol production, such as lysergen. So, a summary of the adrenal cortex and adrenal glands. So, the adrenal glands are located again on top of the kidney, and they are made up of two layers: the adrenal medulla, which is the inner layer, and the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer. The adrenal cortex is made up of three zones: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. The zona glomerulosa produces the mineralocords, and the main one is aldosterone, and these help regulate the blood pressure and water and electrolytes. The zona fasciculata produces glucocorticoids, and the main one is cortisol, and these help mainly with the blood glucose levels. And the last one is the zona reticularis, which produces some sex hormones, but majority of them are produced in the testes and ovaries. Without these hormones, we would not be able to regulate our body in times of stress, and they can result in the disorder Addison's disease, or if you have too much of glucocorticoids, specifically cortisol, it can result in Cushing's syndrome, which both can be fatal if not treated. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed.